On a somber morning at Arlington National Cemetery, where the fallen rest beneath rows of pristine marble headstones, silence carried the weight of grief. No one could have foreseen that this sacred tranquility would soon be shattered by an act of hatred. Major General Sarah Mitchell, a distinguished officer whose uniform bore the legacy of 3 decades of service, stood at the podium. Every medal, every stripe on her chest spoke of sacrifice, resilience, and an unyielding commitment to her country. She was there to honor the life of her dear friend and colleague, Colonel James Harrison, a man who had served with honor for over 20 years. The mourners, draped in military dress in mourning black, stood in solemn reverence, their eyes fixed on the woman whose voice carried both sorrow and admiration. And then, an unwelcome disruption sliced through the moment. Officer Thomas Caldwell, a seasoned police veteran whose past bore the stain of racial bias complaints, pushed his way through the grieving crowd. His presence was jarring, a shadow moving with deliberate intent. And then, in front of hundreds of witnesses, bereaved families, uniformed soldiers, children clutching the hands of their grieving parents, he drew his weapon and aimed it directly at General Mitchell's chest. In that split second, time seemed to hold its breath. The air grew thick with the weight of disbelief. The cold steel of Caldwell's gun gleamed under the gray morning sky, a cruel contradiction against the honor and solemnity of the ceremony. This was more than an act of violence. It was a horrifying collision of authority, prejudice, and unchecked power. What happened in those next moments would shake the nation to its core. It would force America to reckon with the uncomfortable truths buried beneath its ideals, truths about power, about prejudice, and about the true meaning of justice. General Mitchell did not flinch. Her courage, hardened by battle and sharpened by years of fighting for respect in a world reluctant to give it, would set into motion a chain of events that no one could stop. The echoes of that morning would ripple through police departments, courtrooms, and the very conscience of a nation. This is the true story of a woman who stood unshaken in the face of hatred, whose resolve became the catalyst for a verdict that proved no badge, no title, no institution stood above justice. This is the day the system was forced to confront itself, the day history was made. The air was thick with sorrow as General Mitchell's voice carried across the cemetery grounds, weaving a vivid tapestry of Colonel Harrison's life, a man of honor, a soldier of unwavering dedication. The crowd, a sea of polished brass buttons and solemn faces, listened with quiet reverence. Even those trained to suppress emotion in the name of duty could not hide the grief that tightened their throats and weighed heavy on their hearts. Arlington's endless rows of headstones stood as silent witnesses to the moment. The sun, veiled by overcast skies, cast a muted light on Mitchell's uniform, its metals gleaming softly, a testament to battles fought, barriers broken, and a legacy that demanded respect. At 57, her silver-streaked hair spoke of years spent in service, of the sacrifices that came with being a black woman rising through the ranks of the United States Army. She had fought for every accolade, defied every limitation, and earned every ounce of respect. But to Thomas Caldwell, none of it mattered. His presence in the crowd was not subtle. The trench coat he wore was as out of place as the malice in his eyes. He moved with purpose, a dark force threading its way through a gathering that had no place for hatred. And then, in an instant, everything changed. 0244. His face twisted with fury, an anger so deep it seemed to emanate from his very core. Veterans in the crowd would later say they recognized that look, the same chilling gleam they had seen in combat zones, in the eyes of men pushed to the edge of reason. But this was not a battlefield. This was sacred ground, where America's fallen warriors lay in eternal rest. "You don't belong here," he spat, his voice slicing through the solemn air like a blade. The words dripped with venom, a stark violation of the reverence that had settled over the mourners. Several officers instinctively tensed, their hands hovering near their ceremonial sidearms, but General Mitchell remained unmoved. She had faced fire in Baghdad, led soldiers through the unforgiving terrain of Afghanistan, and spent a lifetime proving her worth in a system that had tried to push her aside. Fear had no place in her heart. And then, in a moment that sent shock waves through the gathering, Caldwell pulled his weapon. Time itself seemed to shatter. The black steel of his service pistol, meant to protect and serve, was now aimed at the chest of a woman who had dedicated her life to duty and honor. A collective gasp rippled through the mourners, a wave of horror crashing through the sea of uniforms and grieving families. Parents instinctively pulled their children close. Veterans, stripped of their weapons, but never their instincts, reached for sidearms that were no longer there. Some sought cover behind the nearby headstones, the instinct to survive overpowering the urge to believe this couldn't be real. Yet amid the chaos, the honor guard held their ground. Their discipline, forged in the fires of service, kept them frozen in place, though their grip on their ceremonial rifles tightened until their knuckles turned white. But General Mitchell did not move. Her stance was unwavering, her gaze locked onto the man threatening her life. She had seen death before, had stood firm in the face of enemy fire, and had learned long ago that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand tall in its presence. A breeze swept through the cemetery, rustling the branches of towering oaks, carrying the distant hum of Washington's morning traffic, oblivious to the battle unfolding in this hallowed space. "Sergeant, lower your weapon." Her command rang through the air, crisp and commanding, the same voice that had led troops through the crucible of war. Caldwell's grip only tightened, his knuckles blanched, the tendons in his wrists taut with rage. Beads of sweat formed along his hairline, despite the cool morning air. Beside Mitchell, Colonel Marcus Bennett, a man who had fought beside her in Afghanistan, took a slow step forward. His own hand hovered near his holstered weapon, his voice low and firm. "Think about what you're doing," he warned, his tone carrying the weight of years spent making impossible decisions. "This is a funeral. Stand down." Across the way, Captain Michael Rodriguez, a Marine whose 3 tours in special operations had honed his instincts to a razor's edge, caught something, a flicker in Caldwell's eyes, a tremor in his gun hand, hesitation. Rodriguez had seen it before. That split second when rage collided with doubt, when a man teetered between action and surrender. He knew he had only a moment, and then he moved. With the precision of a man trained for moments like this, Rodriguez lunged, his hands locked around Caldwell's wrist, forcing the weapon skyward just as the trigger was pulled. The gunshot tore through the silence, an explosion of sound that sent birds shrieking from the cemetery trees. It was a sound that did not belong here, a violent, jarring violation of a place meant for remembrance and peace. Gasps turned to cries. The world seemed to spin back into motion as officers surged forward. Rodriguez, his grip unrelenting, wrestled Caldwell to the ground. The struggle was fierce but brief. Years of tactical training snapped into place, each movement deliberate, every soldier understanding their role. Within moments, 4 military personnel pinned Caldwell to the damp earth, securing his weapon. Yet even in restraint, his fury did not subside. He writhed beneath them, his face red with exertion and rage. His voice, raw and venomous, spat words that laid his hatred bare. "She doesn't belong here," he screamed. "This is ours." The ugliness in his words was undeniable, the truth behind his actions unmasked. But General Mitchell did not acknowledge him. With the same unshakable composure that had earned her 2 distinguished service medals, she turned back to the podium. The funeral was not over. Colonel Harrison still deserved his tribute, and no amount of hatred would rob him of that honor. She took a breath, and then she spoke. Her voice was steady, her words carrying more weight than ever before. She continued her eulogy, her presence a testament to resilience, to defiance in the face of prejudice, to the unwavering dignity that no gun, no threat, could ever strip away. In the days that followed, the nation would come to learn the full scope of Caldwell's darkness. Investigators unearthed a pattern: 15 years of unchecked brutality buried beneath bureaucratic red tape, 27 complaints, excessive force against minorities, witnesses silenced, internal affairs reports mysteriously closed, body camera footage that had conveniently malfunctioned, a system that had looked the other way until now. But this time, there was no looking away. The reckoning had begun. For 3 relentless weeks, the Alexandria courthouse became the epicenter of a national reckoning. Cameras lined the steps, reporters jostled for updates, and inside the gallery remained packed day after day. Military personnel, civil rights leaders, law enforcement officials, and everyday citizens who understood that this trial was bigger than one man's crime. One by one, witnesses took the stand, their testimonies weaving together the harrowing picture of that day at Arlington National Cemetery. Junior officers described their horror at watching one of their own, a man sworn to uphold the law, turn his weapon on an unarmed general in the middle of a funeral. Grieving family members spoke of the unbearable moment when their solemn farewell was torn apart by chaos, when their tears of remembrance became tears of terror. But it was Captain Michael Rodriguez's words that struck the deepest. He sat before the jury, his voice unwavering yet thick with restrained emotion. "I saw it in his eyes," he said, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. This wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't a split-second mistake. This was hate, pure, unfiltered hatred. He went to that funeral with a purpose: to intimidate, to harm, to make someone feel like they didn't belong simply because of who they were and what they represented. Then came the moment no one in the courtroom could forget: the surveillance footage. The screens flickered to life, showing frame by frame the events that had rocks a nation. Caldwell moving through the crowd, his trench coat stark against the sea of dress uniforms. The slight tilt of his head as he spotted General Mitchell, his hand slipping beneath his coat. The slow, deliberate way he drew his weapon. The instant of collective dread before Captain Rodriguez leaped into action. And then, the gunshot. The raw, unfiltered terror on people's faces. The veterans reaching for weapons they no longer carried. The moment when the sanctity of that sacred ground was violated by a single act of malice. But what sealed Caldwell's fate wasn't the footage of his actions, it was his own words. The prosecution played his interrogation tape, and the courtroom sat in stunned silence as Caldwell's carefully maintained mask of professionalism shattered. His voice, once measured and composed, now dripped with seething contempt. "People like her," he sneered, his words thick with resentment. "They're changing everything, taking over positions they haven't earned. This isn't what America's supposed to be." His words hung in the air, undeniable, unspinnable. He had not acted out of fear. He had not been confused. He had not been overwhelmed by stress. He had made a choice, a deliberate, premeditated decision to try and silence a woman who embodied everything he hated. The prosecution's case was relentless. They laid bare Caldwell's history, a career riddled with complaints, allegations of excessive force disproportionately targeting minorities, a pattern of misconduct buried under bureaucracy and willful negligence. They exposed how his superiors had overlooked the warning signs, how his racist outbursts had been ignored or excused, how he had operated with impunity for 15 years. Then, they made the jury see the chilling premeditation of his crime. Caldwell had chosen that funeral for a reason. He had known the military personnel would be unarmed, their weapons purely ceremonial. He had counted on their discipline, their restraint, their commitment to order, even in the face of a direct attack. He had calculated his moment, believing no one would dare stop him, but he had miscalculated. His defense team tried to paint a different picture. They spoke of job stress, of a man pushed to the brink, of temporary confusion in a high-pressure moment. It didn't hold. Cross-examination dismantled their narrative piece by piece. Witness after witness recounted past incidents, racist remarks that had gone unchallenged, abuses of power that had been swept under the rug. Former colleagues, some reluctant but no longer willing to stay silent, confirmed what was now undeniable. Caldwell had always been this man. The only difference was that, this time, he had been caught. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours, a shockingly short time for a case of such gravity. When they returned, their verdict was absolute: guilty on all counts: attempted murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, terroristic threats, hate crime enhancements. Caldwell sat motionless as the words were read, his face drained of color, his hands trembling slightly. The weight of justice had finally found him. Then Judge Robert Andrews spoke, and his words would be repeated in courtrooms and police academies for years to come. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying the gravitas of 3 decades on the bench, "you wore a uniform meant to protect and serve. Instead, you used it as armor for your prejudice. You aimed a weapon at a woman who has dedicated her life to this nation's defense. Today, justice strips you of that armor. Then came the final blow, the sentence. Life in prison, no possibility of parole. It was more than a punishment. It was a message. The verdict sent ripples across the nation. For too long, the system had protected men like Caldwell, shielding them behind the blue wall, burying their misdeeds in bureaucratic shadows. But now the wall had cracked. Justice had forced its way through. In the weeks that followed, police departments across the country launched internal investigations. Old complaints were reopened. Officers once thought untouchable found themselves under scrutiny. Policies were rewritten. The culture of silence began to erode, replaced by a new, hard-earned accountability. And General Mitchell? She returned to Fort Knox, where she stood before a new generation of officer candidates, young men and women who would soon take their place in the ranks of service. She looked at them, her gaze steady, her voice as unwavering as ever. Power is not measured by the weapon you carry or the badge you wear, she told them. It is measured by your commitment to something greater than yourself. Her words became more than a speech. They became doctrine. Across the country, police academies incorporated them into training programs. They played the Arlington footage in classrooms, not just as a cautionary tale, but as proof that justice prevails when good people refuse to back down. At Arlington National Cemetery, a small plaque now marks the spot where General Mitchell stood her ground. It bears a simple inscription, "Courage knows no rank." Because in the end, this story was never just about one man's hatred. It was about the unwavering resolve of those who refused to be cowed by it. It was about accountability finally piercing through the shield of impunity. It was about proving that the ideals of justice, fairness, and service are more than just words. They are a promise. And when that promise is threatened, it is up to us all to stand and defend it.